Hello everyone, Randy Harrington here. Tonight's video, I'm going to talk to you about tree knocks. And the reason I'm putting together this video about tree knocks is because the last video that I put out that involved the daytime video footage that Shane captured at the 400 of that juvenile was preceded by two individual knocks from two different locations on each side of our campsite. Clearly, because of the video and the thermal that I captured, came from one or both of the juvenile Bigfoots at the 400. And they had moved into position around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And then they did a knock. One did a knock on the west side, one did a knock on the east side, clearly to signal each other, to let each other know that they were in position. And I just described that in the video. So if you haven't seen that video, you might want to. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you all of the anecdotal information that I have and the experiences that we have had over the years that involve knocks and the things that were happening during the knocks and maybe even after and before, just so that we can get an understanding of how and why they use knocks. So we're going to start this storyline with my first encounter at the Chickasaw Park. And within the happenings of that encounter, it involved communications. And some of the understanding that I had of it that night doesn't match what I think it is now because of how many discussions we've had about it with other people. But the little one was dragging a stick, had a physical stick in its possession, and I heard it being dragged through the gravel, and it was hitting lantern posts. I could hear it hitting metal lantern posts as it was going from trash can to trash can within the park system there. And I was the only one there. So, and then when it got to the back side of my truck, it hit a tree for the first and only time. So when it hit the tree, I heard splashing come across the creek. So that means more than likely that tree being hit was the signal that called another one from across the creek to the area. So before that, all of the other hittings of the metal lantern posts more than likely was to let the big one across the creek know where it was located within the park system as it was going from trash can to trash can. So it was kind of meandering through the park, and while it was hitting lantern post, the one on the back side of the creek, which I'm assuming was the big large one, was able to keep track of it that way. Because when it did hit the tree and the big one crossed the creek, it was immediate. It was already to the point where it was close to my campsite when it crossed the creek. So that means, it couldn't have all been randomly at the right place, when it needed to be, unless it was following along that side of the creek by following the knocks on the lantern post so that it was actually in position so that when it did hit the tree, it crossed the creek immediately. So to me, and I've always said this way back then in 2006, that they were communicating with each other. They had to have had conversations about what to hit with the stick and where to hit it, and how it could alert the second one to come over, because that's what it appeared to be like to me. And now I think we have a better understanding of their intelligence and their strategic levels of intelligence and how they put together things and their planning. And so now I think it's easier to believe it. Back then, it was a bit of a stretch for me to say that and have it be believable. But now I think we have a better understanding of it, and truly it can be believed. So, people may say and think that they could possibly use mouth pops or chest thumps or hand slaps or a clap to make a knocking noise. But I've also heard somebody say that the reason they believe that is because of how fast they would get a reply with a tree knock. So they would get a reply relatively quickly, and they couldn't see how one of these creatures could find a stick, a suitable stick for hitting a tree, responding to a tree knock in a timely fashion that would satisfy the listener. So they come up with the idea, well, then they must be doing it with their mouth or hitting their chest or clapping their hands together. Yeah, and maybe that's true. But in this one instance, it had a stick in its possession. It had a stick that it was using. And that also brings to mind that I was listening to a video of an encounter where a man was telling a story when he was a boy picking blueberries, and he encountered a Bigfoot that was also picking blueberries in this blueberry thicket, and they eventually saw each other's hands reaching out, plucking berries and pulling them back, and got closer and closer to where they even touched hands. So it was a very docile encounter, not any aggression at all, until the boy's dog came from around the back side of the cabin and come running towards the thicket, barking and growling. And the man described the behaviors of the Bigfoot of jumping from the thicket, running to a tree line, and with one hand reached up and snapped about a 2-inch diameter or 3-inch diameter branch off of the tree trunk as it spun around and broke the limb that it had just stripped off the trunk with its other hand, and it spun around, crouched down with a stick in its hand, a club in its hand that was about 3 or 4 foot long, 2-inch diameter. So within a matter of seconds, it snatched a branch and turned it into a billy club in just a couple of seconds. So that's the only time I've ever heard somebody give that kind of detail in how quickly a striking instrument could be snatched off a tree and formed in just a couple of seconds. So if that's true, then time is of no essence. When somebody says, well, it responded in just a couple of seconds or a few seconds, so it had to be by its mouth or hitting its chest. Well, if that gentleman is telling the truth, then they can make a club anytime they want to. And needless to say, the one going through the park at the Chickasaw Park indeed had a stick in its hand. So let's just leave that out there, that I believe they physically use sticks. And I'm going to play some audio later of other proof that I think shows that they are using a physical wooden stick to make these noise. So let's move on. All right, this next story takes us up to Bay Horse Lake in Idaho, and it's somewhere a little bit southwest of Challis, Idaho. And I did a video about a lady who had a face-to-face encounter that I went to church with, and it happened on the Salmon River. They're just outside of Challis. So looking on the map, I found a place that had campsites that I could go to on my way up to Washington so that I could just kind of experience the area. So here's a map of the area. There's 2 lakes. There's an upper lake and a lower lake, and there's campsites around each lake. So I went there and I drove around the lower lake or up to the lower lake, and nobody was there. Somebody was fishing. And then I went up to the other lake, and there was only 2 or 3 campsites being used up there. So I went back down to the lower, smaller lake to park my truck. And here's what happened. All right, so here's a little bit closer view of the lower lake, and there were some people there fishing, and the red dot at the end of the white trail is where I parked my truck. So there was a little wooden dock reaching out about 12, 13 feet into the water, and there was a guy sitting on there with a tackle box fishing, and there were two other people standing there talking with him. But while I was getting my stuff set up, for my little camping area, the two people that were standing there with him took off walking, and I drew the yellow map showing where there was a trail going up between up a ravine to that upper lake, upper campsite, which you could not see from this lower lake because it was up through the trees, and so I'm assuming it was about a 3/4 of a mile away, maybe even a mile away. But so while I was getting in my truck and setting some things up, and the people took off walking up that trail, and they got between the two tree lines and headed out of sight, I heard two knocks, and I immediately was looking at the guy on the dock because I thought maybe he was closing up his tackle box, and I was hearing the buckles being latched close on his tackle box. And since they were so distinct, the knocks were so distinct, I walked over to the dock and I said, "Hey," were you just happen to be getting in your tackle box?" And he said, "No." I said, "Did you hear a couple of knocks?" And he goes, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, where did they come from?" And he pointed over to a cluster of trees where I drew the red circle. It was to his right and my right, and he said it came from over there. And so that's kind of interesting that the two people walked up the trail between those two ridges, and in a cluster of trees after they left, gone up the hill, there were two knocks. So can they count? I don't know. Maybe. Did that two knocks signify, two people walking? Maybe. I don't know. There's still a guy there fishing, and he eventually packed up his tackle box and walked on up the trail too, and then I was left there alone. I didn't have anything happen significant that I could report while I slept there that night, but it left me a little excited nonetheless because of those knocks. And but at least it's interesting of where they were at it from that thick grove of trees on the right side of that lower lake and relation to the trail. And I hadn't heard any knocks before that or after that, and it did involve the two people walking by on a trail. So that's interesting. All right, let's go to the next one. All right, this next one involves me going up to the Walla Walla area and along the Mill Creek Road and up into the Blue Mountains in one of Paul Freeman's areas. Tiger Canyon Road, you can see Tiger Canyon Road there inching its way up the steep mountain to the Skyline Ridge Road. And that's the road that he had his encounter on when he was on horseback guarding the watershed. So beyond that, I was up there at a place called Squaw Springs. Now on this map, the yellow line represents the Tiger Canyon Road going up all the way to the Skyline Road. You can see a little blue dot. That little blue dot is the Educt Pond, the spring-fed pond where Paul Freeman caught one of his most famous video was at that little pond on the backside where he found the prints, and then up in behind there's where he captured that video. But anyways, you go further up on Skyline Road and you see that red dot. That red dot is a small campsite at the base of a spring called Squaw Spring. And that's where this next happening that involves some knocks come into play. So I pulled back into the Squaw Spring camp area. And when I say camp area, it was actually just a small spring-fed pool with just a few campsites. And there actually was somebody there. His name was J.C. Williams, and he and I became friends. At this point, he was a naturalist from Georgia who was up there doing a long-term 1 month game camera study of animals. And he was a Bigfoot believer, possibly, he said. So he and I had discussions. We became friends, and I actually met him up there the following summer also, where he was doing the same month-long trail camera, track situation. So I was able to meet him up there 2 years in a row. But this night, or these few nights that I was there this first time, I started doing some recordings, putting out my logs at night so that we could ascertain what's going on. And here's what happened. So here's a little closer view of the area. The red circle is where I was parked, and the footsteps is where I would walk uphill to the head of that spring. And that's where I would set up a tent, and I would leave a recorder. I didn't have my log recorders at the time, I don't think. No, I didn't. So I actually had a recorder sitting in a tent that I would set up. So I'd carry a tent up there, set it up, and leave a recorder in the tent to see what activity could be picked up that way. And we did pick up a lot of tree knocks. Now, J.C. Williams and I had a lot of conversations about these knocks because I would be listening to them the next day, and I'd be like, man, I'm hearing knocks all over the place up there on that ridge, and you can see where the arrows are pointing on the ridge up there. Yeah, so, and he was saying that, there's got to be something natural. There has to be some natural reasons why we're hearing those knocks. And so I said, okay, well, let's be logical. Why aren't we hearing them in the woods right here by our campsite? If it's something happened naturally in the woods, then it should be happening in the woods all over the place, not just isolated pockets up there on that ridge. And he actually told me that he's not ready to believe that there are that many to account for that many knocks that we were hearing. I mean, I was probably catching 25, 30 knocks a night on the recorder. So we just thought that was interesting. Of course, we had this interesting conversation. And so then the next night, we go through this process again where I leave a recorder up there, and I hear the knocks, and something interesting happens. You can hear a tree knock where the stick breaks and falls and clanks and clacks as the stick falls broken. And I was like, wow. So I let Jason hear that, and he said, that surely changes things. It indeed is some type of stick being wielded and used, or you wouldn't be able to hear it break. So I will play a loop of a regular knock from that occasion, and then the knock where you can hear the stick break in 5 loops.
The stick breaks, which is significant, if you ask me.
So there you have it. Another instance where it was using a physical stick or a physical club that you can hear break against whatever it was striking. It could have been a log, it could have been a tree, could have been anything, but you hear the stick break and then fall. So let's move on to the next one, and that is in the same area in the Walla Walla Mountains. It was further north from there, and I did a video about it, about something peeking into the windshield while I was sleeping and left its hairs stuck into the bug guts on my windshield. And it was over between Biscuit Ridge and Black Snake Ridge. But it also involves a knock that I heard. And I'm going to give the circumstances around that knock. After I got the hairs stuck into bug guts on my windshield, I went up there for a night myself, and I parked my truck, and I took a recorder out and I set it on top of my truck, and then I just took off walking. I walked about a mile, just to case the area, and then come back to my truck. And I wanted to listen to the recorder and see if anything happened around my truck while I was gone. And indeed, something did. I mean, it wasn't spectacular, but you could hear me walking away in the gravel of the logging road. You can hear me kicking rocks as I'm leaving. And about 5 minutes after you couldn't hear me walking anymore, I can't tell you how far away I was at that point, but I heard a nice, crisp, clear knock. And when I heard that, when I listened to the recorder later and heard how soon the knock happened after I walked away from the vehicle, I could only think to myself, certainly whatever did the knock was signaling some other person, creature, and probably just letting them know that, hey, I'm leaving the area, or he's walking away, or whatever the communication means. But that's the only time I heard it on the recorder. It didn't knock as I came back. So maybe they were trailing me. Maybe they followed me as I walked. And I don't know. All I know is that the knock happened, and the time that I walked away, about the time, 5 minutes after I'd left the vehicles, when the knock was heard. So it's some kind of communication amongst themselves, like the coast is clear, or whatever. Who knows? But the communication was there. So another one. That's another interesting one. All right, this next photo shows exactly where I was parked up by Mount Baker, which was really close to the Canadian border. I went up there because of a friend of mine that lived up in Bellingham, or Bellevue, or somewhere up there, and then he directed me to go, to this area around Mount Baker with some activity. So I was camping there for a few nights, and around 4 a.m. one morning, I got a nice, loud, crisp knock. Now, it could have been a rock thrown, it could have been a rock hitting something, but I didn't hear the rock tumble on the ground or hit any branches. It was just a lone, single knock. So I'm going to assume it was a tree knock, but I'm going to let you hear it. I'm going to play the audio to it, and it happened at 4 a.m., and it woke me up. I didn't know what it was until I heard it on the recorder later, because when it woke me up, it was just a noise. But when I heard it on the recorder, it sounds like a knock. So this is another one. All right, this next one is going to take us back to the 400. One time we were down in the base camp area, and Shane and Dan Nadrello wanted to go up to Walmart, and I decided to stay in a hammock. I was already taking a nap in the hammock, so I was kind of sunk down into the hammock like a big taco, and so you couldn't see me. And I was motionless. And they said that they were going to run up to the vehicles, take the Polaris, and go up to the vehicles and go into town and go to Walmart. And I just told them I was going to stay there and catch a few naps, catch a few winks. And we had a recorder going. So when they left and started meandering up that long, rugged trail out of there, and where I could barely hear the Polaris, I heard a tree knock. And here's that first tree knock. Then a couple of minutes later, or a few minutes later, there was another knock. And again, there was a third knock. a minute or two later. And the reason I'm showing you all these three different knocks is because they sounded like they were three different distances away. Now, there's another time at the 400 that involved a very significant knock that we heard one night, and surprisingly, the next day, when Shane was back in that corner of the field where we heard the knock come from, that's the day we found the new set of 6-inch tracks, and I think it was October of 22. And so the new 6-inch tracks were accompanied by an older set of tracks, or an older sibling. I believe they were like 9.5 inches at that time, maybe 10. So we found two sets of tracks, and the 6-inch tracks led to one of the holes being dug that we also did a video on. So you might want to check out the holes being dug videos where the sticks were left in the holes. So these 6-inch tracks led it back into some deep brush, where Shane found another stick in one of the holes. And just within that cluster of footprints, there was a rock sitting on top of a log. And that came from the same corner that we heard that loud knock the night before and caught it on recorder. So this, we believe, shows that they are using a rock to do a knock. So it doesn't take much of a jump, in logic when you see a rock back in that thick brush sitting on top of a log that something not natural is going on, that something put that rock on the log. Especially given the fact that there were two different sets of footprints around. So clearly it was the younger ones, the youngest of the family unit and its sibling. So what if the knock, since we only heard one knock and we never heard a reply, it was just a knock to let one of the parents know where they were at, that they were safe? Possibly, I don't know. Given the fact that both footprints were found in that little area and the rock was left on the log, maybe the juvenile didn't think that leaving the rock on the log would be noticed, by Shane or myself, but it was noticed. So it was able to help feed the storyline that the knock we heard from that location was probably that rock hitting the log, and it was one of the two younger ones doing it. So who were they communicating with? What's the significance of them needing to do a knock? I mean, it would be too dangerous to alert us. What if they made a knock and we go running back into that area and cause them danger? We don't do that kind of stuff. But you have to think, given that's a possibility, then the knock must be something important to them. And of course, they think that we don't understand, what they are, that they're doing the knocks. It's kind of like their secret language. But yeah, we think that one shows that one of the little ones did a knock to let mom or dad, whoever was overseeing them doing whatever they were doing, or listening over the area, needed to know where they were at, and that's why that log was used as a message relaying device. At least that's what it appears to us. And leave your comments. I mean, maybe you see it that way too. I haven't seen these myself, but Shane has said that he has found in several locations up on those ridge where rocks were left in the forks of trees, about 3 or 4 feet off the ground. And so we try to think to ourselves, what does that mean? Well, since we found that rock on the log, and so that means we think at least that one instance, it wasn't a wood on wood knock, but a rock on wood knock. We can't determine the difference. You know, we're not smart enough. I mean, I'm not smart enough to tell if it's a rock hitting a tree or a wooden stick hitting the tree. You know, clearly, I think they use both, or I wouldn't have heard them dragging a stick or breaking a stick in the Blue Mountains. So they use both a stick and a rock if they need to. But the fact that Shane has found a few rocks in certain locations, that tells me that they have set locations. And that just makes sense with what we know about them now. Let's just say Big Daddy sends Junior up over to that south ridge and says, "Let me know when you get in position." And Dad already knows where there's 3 different trees with a rock set up for a knock. So all he needs to do is hear the knock to know exactly where Junior is set up. To me, that makes more sense, knowing how intelligent they are and how smart and strategic they are in their planning, that if they have certain locations they set up as phone booths where they can just do a knock, then it doesn't have to be random. And I think that proves that it's not random, that just up on a ridge somewhere it's doing a knock. Well, how can another one even know exactly where it's at? It'll just hear it somewhere over on that ridge. But if they have rocks set up in certain locations, then that's a different story. That means that they know exactly where the knock is being made, and and then it moves on to the next one, and then does a return knock, and Dad knows where it is again because they set the second one up at that other location, and that's where Junior's at now. To me, with that little one going through my Chickasaw Park encounter, hitting the lantern post, and the big one was following along the backside of the creek by knowing where he was within the park, and he was immediately where he needed to be when the signal came to come across the creek. Now that falls in line with what Shane is describing of finding these rocks in the forks of trees. That means they have a more precise knowledge of where one of their family members is located when they're making these communications, and that's just smart. And I think the proof is telling us that. But but clearly we are speculating. We're looking at what we've seen and what I've heard. I've given you a few stories of what happened in the moment while they were happening, and the knocks specifically meant one form of communication because we didn't hear any more, and things like that. Man, it's fascinating to me, and I hope it's fascinating to you too. I mean, we're really starting to get into some nuts and bolts of what's going on here, but I suggest that you do not tree knock. Please don't go out there and just do, silly knocks, and you're like, well, they'll respond to them, and yeah, but you know what? You're interfering with what they think is a secret language. Let them have that secret language. Revel in the knowledge that you know what they're doing, but don't confuse it. Don't start hitting trees and whooping and hollering and being silly. Let them do what they're going to do and just enjoy the process and try to learn from it. All you're going to do is confuse things. If you go out there banging on trees and making sounds and doing vocals and stuff like that, let them be the ones doing all that stuff, and you just be an observer and enjoy it and record it. That makes it fun, because then we can put together a better picture. Instead of them doing something that's actually responding to you, we know that they're communicating with each other, and then we can start to try to figure things out. All right. You guys, please subscribe, share, like, and leave a comment. I mean, there's plenty on this video to wrap your head around, and leave me a comment, man. Let's chat about this. I enjoy it. So thank you so much for tuning in. Bye-bye.